Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our seminar. It started to be an academic seminar face-to-face, but we had a lot of people who are requested to be online, and we're now having the seminar as a hybrid. So this seminar is first of a series of seminars that we want to have under the Living Landscape in Action project. This project is funded by the Oak Foundation, where we want to kind of bring in social justice and spatial justice into the conservation and biodiversity space. Dr. Lerato Tapoli is one of our leading scholars in the field. Lerato is a geographer by instinct, and she just completed a PhD last year. She was for 2 years a postdoc with class under the Living Landscape project, and she is now a lecturer at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So Lerato is just coming fresh out of the field. In the Living Landscape in Action, we've got 3 field sites. Mapungubwe, where Lerato is coming from just yesterday. And then we have Cape Town, mainly Edith Stevens and the surrounding areas, Wolfhut in the surrounding areas, and also Makassar. And the other living landscape that we are working on is Isimangaliso, and we have 2 field researchers, research associates that are based there. So this is the first series of monthly webinar seminars on the Living Landscape project, and we will have all of us presenting some of our work. So Lerato is a geographer by nature, but she's also strong in labor and property. And with the Living Landscape project, she's also looking strongly into spatial and social justice. Her topic for today is around, and I asked Lerato to play a bit around of what are the topic that is coming out of the field now being in Mapungubwe, and he said it is about cross-border labor geographies in the South African periphery. So Lerato, over to you. We are excited that you are part of this and looking forward to your presentation. So let me just say there is a Twitter handle that is #crossborder that we will follow. It is recorded on Zoom, and we will allow around 25 minutes of presentation for Lerato, and then the rest for question and answer. We keep it to a 1-hour slot. So Lerato, I might squeeze you if you go a little bit over time, but over to you. Thank you very much for those who are here physically, and hello to everyone who are there online.
Right. Thank you, Prof. Isaacs, for that very generous introduction. What really, I'm very excited to be here because I was a colleague at class, not for a long time, but I was yeah, so I'm delighted to come back and to share some of the work that we've been doing with the Living Landscapes in Action project. So before beginning or diving into the work that we've been doing in the Greater Mapungubwe landscape with Maud, who's also online at the moment, I wanted to give you a little teaser trailer as to how I ended up studying labor and why I think it's important for understanding value production in the South African landscape. So to do that, I will first begin my presentation with a conversation about conservation labor geographies, which is where I began my foray into understanding how workers paid and unpaid are contributing to conservation landscapes. And then I will go into labor geographies in the periphery, which is the kind of work that we're doing with Maud in the Greater Mapungubwe landscape. And to do that, I will frame it within the Bite Bridge and Corndrift borderscapes, which is an area between, of course, Bite Bridge and Corndrift, bordering Zimbabwe and Botswana respectively. And to really hone in as to what we mean by these landscape labor geographies, I will talk about 3 key sectors that are one of the major land uses in that area. So like I said, before I get into that story, I want to tell you just what I've been doing in my past life before I began with the Living Landscapes project. So to locate you a bit, this is where I did my PhD. It's called the Lowveld area, an area sandwiched between the Kruger National Park in the, I think you can see my pointer or not, doesn't matter, but in the dark green, that's Kruger National Park. And on the west of that, that sort of north-south lying light green is the Bladey Canyon Nature Reserve. And it has one of the biggest canyons in the world. And in between that, you have all these villages that are now part of the Greater Bushbuckridge municipality. And then north of that, in light green, you have private nature reserves. So these are areas that are owned by companies, individuals, families, but predominantly owned by white landowners. So this is where my work has been located thus far. I didn't do research in the Kruger National Park. My key focus has always, or has thus far, been mainly on private nature reserves. And this area is very significant in the South African context because, of course, of the Kruger effect. You have a lot of tourists going into the space, driving from Johannesburg, flying into Mpumalanga, flying into Pittsburgh itself, to kind of view the what South Africa has to offer, the ecotourism, the Big Five, and the like. And my work was really located around the Akenhoek, which is in the far north of Bushbuckridge, and also Hoedspruit, a small town which is surrounded mainly by private nature reserves, as well as these residential wildlife estates where, you know, if you have good bucks, you can go live with wildlife, fauna, and flora. So these are, in terms of land uses from a geographical perspective, the land use differences are incredibly stark. And for me, this led to the question, why is this landscape as it is? Why do you have so many villages on the south, and in the north of that, you have just a landscape filled with private nature conservation? So this is where my journey into labor began. And to foreground that a bit more, I would like to tell you a story of Mo. And this area, this sort of Google Maps screenshot is of the same landscape. In the south, you have Akenhoek, and that line running west to east is the Orpin Road. So that Orpin Road will finally lead you into Kruger National Park. And then the north of that, you have the private nature reserves, the Klasiris, Timbavati. So really nature spaces that pride themselves in protecting South Africa's heritage. So to, again, underscore my foray into labor, I'd like to tell you a story of Mo. Mo is a mother of 2. She lives in Akenhoek, and she works in a private nature reserve that is privately owned by a family. And every morning, Mo wakes up around 4 a.m. to get ready for work. She'll boil water, she'll pack lunch for her children, and around 6 a.m. she's already stepped on the bus to make her way to the private nature reserve. And this trip will take her about 40 minutes to an hour. And finally, the bus will drop Mo off at the gate of the private nature reserves. And in the meantime, her mom is back at home taking care of her children, making sure that they finally get on their own bus to get to school. So when Mo enters the private nature reserve gate, she will walk 2 kilometers within an area with wildlife and predators. To finally make her way to the reception where she will present herself for work. And the kind of activities that Mo does during the day is to mend the fence, take care of the animal pens, make sure that the landscape is taken care of such that tourists like myself, then you can go and enjoy nature in South Africa. At the end of the day, Mo goes back to work, goes back home rather, where she'll meet her mom and her children. She'll help around with the laundry. She'll help with the children's homework. And if she has time, she'll also tend to the garden, which is at times taking care of other family members. So this is the story of moles, but there's many moles that kind of go through this rhythm day in, day out, going into private nature reserves, expending their labor, creating value for tourists, whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive products. So to sort of unpack the kind of value that mole and many other Black conservation laborers create within this landscape, I've borrowed from scholars that have conceptualized conservation as a mode of production. And here they suggest that in spite of the fact that conservation has been seen as something that's outside of capital, they argue that conservation is also value producing. Conservation is also a space where money is made of, essentially. And this could be through consumptive or non-consumptive products, which Mo and many other conservation laborers are integral in creating. I've also borrowed from geographers who argue that spaces are socially produced. And I think that's incredibly important in thinking about the South African landscape, that if you produce something, it means you can produce something else. So the kind of landscapes that we have right now are not set in stone. They can be remade. We can put our hearts and soul and minds at it, and we have all the political will. But that's a conversation for another day. So space is socially produced, and this is evident within the conservation landscapes through evictions, through fencing, which Mo is integral in maintaining, is through land use zoning, and also forms of infrastructural development. Coupled with these two thoughts, I've also borrowed from Marxist geographers' work that argue that capitalism will always produce spaces that are integral for its reproduction. That is, if you have a factory or a plantation or a farm, that capitalism will work increasingly hard to make sure that those spaces of production are maintained. So if we take the first idea in conjunction with this, it begs the idea that conservation too will continue to produce spaces that reproduce it and maintain it in particular ways. So taken together, conservationists do create spaces for that advancement of conservation. Conservationists also create spaces where capital can be accumulated. But this is still quite a very capital-centric analysis, right? Where is the story of laborers? Where are we, where do laborers feature in when we start thinking about how spaces are produced? And this is where I've entered the discussion of labor geographers, who argue that labor geographies is an effort to see the making of the economic geography of capitalism through the eyes of labor. By understanding how workers seek to make space in particular ways, that is to say, how they seek to make the landscape in their own image. So labor geographers here were lamenting the fact that Marxist geographers for the longest time were always concerned with how capital produces space. And here they were arguing workers are also integral in understanding how different spaces are created. Similarly, it is about foregrounding workers as active geographic agents of change. And finally, labor geographies is really interested in how capital and labor reproduce space. So it's not just that, oh, only laborers make space, but really what is the intertwined relationship between capital and labor that produces space in particular ways. So there is a lot of ethnographic material that I have drawn on within the conservation landscape, within the stories of Mo and other conservation laborers, to finally come to the conceptualization of conservation labor geographies. And I will park it here for now in the interest of time, basically to say that when I was trying to understand conservation labor geographies was really to understand how conservation landscapes control and reproduce workers. But in the same vein, what kind of spaces workers also make within that landscape. So this could be workers hanging out in the private nature reserve, contravening some management rules just to also have a good time in spaces that are often secluded. Conservation labor geographies is also interested about the history of Mo and many others who were evicted from the private nature reserves, or rather whose parents and grandparents were evicted from the private nature reserves in the 1920s to 1960s and are finally now going back to expend their labor. So those are the kind of spaces that I am interested in, is how does labor and also conservation create these landscapes. So I will move on from that little nugget about how I finally came to a discussion of landscape labor geography. So moving away from conservation in particular to trying to understand how do broader landscapes control, maintain, reinforce particular labor relations. So both of these pictures are taken on the South African border during a time I've spent in the Greater Mapubupe landscape. On the right, you have a fisher person who is fishing in the Limpopo River, and north of that is Botswana. And in the right picture, the picture is taken from South Africa, and across that not so well maintained fence, you have Zimbabwe. So this is the landscape within which we've been working in as the Living Landscape project. And to give you a geographical sense of where this area is, so you have Beitbridge, and Musina just south of that, and on that sort of road that's highlighted in the south, that's the road leading towards Venetia mine, which is 45 years, and if you turn right towards the north is the Pondrick border with Botswana. So this is where Maud and I have been spending a lot of time interviewing our people, just spending time, and as we never calls it, doing slow, it's not working. And to give you a better sense of where we are, this still can't see my point, it doesn't matter, but that area where Mapubupe National Park is located, that's where most of the private nature reserves of the national park are located. So a lot of that is conservation land use. There's also quite a lot of agriculture, commercial agriculture. That name Baby is a farm owned by I won't say more, but that establishment or that organization. So there's quite a lot of conservation, but also commercial agriculture with farmers growing water mostly directly from the Limpopo River. And in the other blue circle, you have Venetia mine, which I think is staggering that you can see it from Google Maps. That's just the kind of holes that they create in space. And of course, Messina and Oldies, which are towns, sort of the administrative centers of this landscape. So this is where the Living Landscape has been located thus far. And within that landscape, we've mostly spent our time on a land claimed farm within Mapubupe National Park. So unlike many national parks in South Africa, Mapubupe is divided into two sections. And in the middle of that, you have this farm that was awarded to the community, the Samata and Machete communities, some of which have resettled on the farm and are participating in all forms of livelihood activities. But their property is really right along the border of South Africa and Botswana in this case, and that is where Maud is located at the moment. So a brief note on methodology. I have been to Mapubupe 3 times since the project began for different times or different times. And in the project, we also have Maud, who's permanently based on that land claim farm that I mentioned, so Denstad. We also have a relationship with the Inclusive Development Trust, whose offices are in Polokwane, and I think some of you might know them And we have a collaboration with a field worker who's been doing amazing work in the area with regards to farmer rights workshops and the like. So this is the kind of ethnographic work that we've been doing. Maud, myself, and our field worker, whose name is Mbulani, have also been interviewing farmers, farm workers, families of farm workers, farm dwellers, government officials, and a whole host of others. And we've also been doing a lot of participant observation, more so than me at this stage, and also Mbulani, the field worker from Ubuzi. So this is the work that we've been doing within this landscape. And the key sort of, so really foregrounding what I talked about conservation, but I was really, or some of the themes that have started to emerge within this landscape is that it is important to center, I think, landscapes more broadly than looking at a sector, because this allows us to understand more broadly the kind of labor dynamics within a region. And one of the key land uses, which I've already mentioned, is conservation. There's also a lot of commercial agriculture, and also quite a big De Beers diamond mine, which is a key player within the landscape. And all these sectors, of course, produce different products. With conservation, you might have hunting, you could have non-consumptive products such as ecotourism. With the mine, you have diamonds that are exported for various forms of uses. And of course, we have commercial agriculture and self-reporting from some of the farms, such as that they export much of the goods that they produce on the farms. But in spite of these sort of major differences, there's one thing that I think really ties these land uses together, and that's kind of the labor geographies that these landscapes are part of. So to dive right into sort of the ethnographic work that we have been doing, with regards to conservation, you have the state-owned park where there's a lot of ecotourism. There's a lot of private nature or private conservation areas that are involved in hunting, whether for trophies or for biltong as well. There's ecotourism in the area, from high-end to sort of affordable-ish, depending on what income bracket you are in. And of course, De Beers has a Venetia Nature Reserve, which is part of their offset agreement. So in terms of the labor dynamics within this conservation area, what we have found so far is that there are a lot of caretakers, property caretakers within the Mapubuwe landscape. So what this means in practice is that the property owner often lives in Johannesburg. This is excluding the state park, of course, but on the private nature reserves, you have property owners that live in Johannesburg and as far as Cape Town, who have left that property in the care of South Africans, but also a lot of Zimbabwean families that live on these properties. And by families, I mean one caretaking family managing hectares and hectares of bushveld. And oftentimes the family we haven't delved into whether they're documented or undocumented, and I don't think that's important at this stage. But these are families that really, it's a husband and a wife, a couple of aunties, a couple of uncles, many children living on this property and taking care of it in the absence of the landowner. When a tourist comes, it is incumbent on the wife to make sure that the lodge is clean. The husband will do the kind of game viewing activities, mending the fence, that kind of reproductive work that maintains the landscape. And a lot of these migrant workers, of course, are sending money back home to Zimbabwe. Every so often, they also take some time off in, of course, rotation, because the property needs to be maintained, to go spend time with family in Zimbabwe. And what I found curious was that there are lots of children living on the farm. And I think all of you will know the kind of farm conditions in South Africa where the schools are far out. The government will provide a bus, but never quite always on time if it ever comes. So you have quite a lot of children that are just on the farm, following mom and dad around and already expending their labor as well, helping with menial tasks, with little tasks that they can do. So here, again, it is important to kind of foreground the kind of labor that is central in reproducing conservation spaces in the periphery With regards to the South African families, they are often also on state grants, so they will have child grant. Some grannies that are on the farm will get what's it called, old age grant as well. That's probably not the official word for it, but something along those lines. And on the farm as well, there's a lot of subsistence activities that families are engaged in within the conservation landscape. There's farming, a little plot of land will be set aside for farming. They have livestock within an area of predators. There's also fishing as well in the Limpopo River. So this is just to say, in addition to the kind of salary that these families are getting, they are also involved in other activities just to augment the kind of salaries that they're getting, which is rarely ever enough. So in the absence of these migrant workers in Zimbabwe, the people that are doing the reproductive work in Zimbabwe is the wives, the in-laws, the grandparents who ensure that the children can go to school while the mom and dad are out working in South Africa. So these are the kind of labor dynamics that are unfolding within conservation in this peripheral area along the border of South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. In addition to this, we have mining and labor, and admittedly, this is something that Maud and I still need to dive into a bit more, but there are already, I think, interesting themes that are emerging out of this. Musina in the past had around 4 mines of copper, and this is from 1914 to 1992 when the mines were finally closed. And much like the gold fields in Johannesburg, a lot of workers that were working in the copper mines were coming from as far out as Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So Musina is a very dynamic, very cosmopolitan town. We have generations and generations of families that have been involved in copper mining that have now settled in South Africa and call it home. And in the past, a lot of the migrant workers were living in hostels, but later on, the mines made it possible for families to join them. And that's why Musina does have a long history of migrant workers as well. So here again, like this shows that the kind of labor dynamics that we're interested in here really have a long history. So when the copper mine closed in around Musina, in 1992, De Beers went in and started operating a mine, Venetia, which is 80 kilometers from Musina. And much of the laborers that work in the Venetia mine come from the border Limpopo province. So these aren't migrant workers, unlike a copper mine. And what this means is that as a result of the shift in resource production within the landscape from copper to mining, there's also been a change in the kind of labor requirements and labor migration, especially in relation to mining in particular. So lastly, we have our great or biggest land user, which is commercial agriculture. And the kind of products that are produced in this space are avocados, tomatoes, citrus, and many more. And it's difficult to really get how much is coming out of this space because there's a lot of self-reporting, but that's something that Maud and I still need to follow up on. But safe to say, a lot of these farms, at least from that self-reporting, again, export the produce to different parts of the world. Many of them are along the Limpopo River, so they draw water directly from the Limpopo River. And curiously, they're also, the whole landscape is also monitored by CCTV cameras along the river and along the main roads in South Africa. So it's quite a monitored landscape. You feel it when you're there, you see the cameras around, so it also gives you a feeling that you're always being watched. So in terms of the labor dynamics that we have started to unearth within the commercial agriculture, is that there's quite a lot of seasonal workers within this landscape coming from Zimbabwe. And I was at the labor department one time, and one of the employees showed me a request from one of the private farmers who was asking for 750 Zimbabweans to come in during the picking season to pick stuff up. And this is enabled by this narrative that I'm sure we've all heard ad nauseum, that all South Africans are lazy, that South Africans don't want to work. And this narrative wouldn't matter so much if it didn't have material implications, but it does. It means that a lot of South Africans are not employed in that sector, and for good reason, because the job sucks. You know, it's horrible working conditions. Why would you work there? And I think the farmers, of course, also exploit that sense, especially with migrant workers. On some farms, which will not be mentioned, but I'm sure you can guess which one I'm talking about, the red and yellow. We found instances where farm workers are just not allowed to leave the compounds during the week. The only time that they can leave is on weekends to go play soccer in the field and then come back to the compound again. And much of these laborers are migrant workers. So you can just imagine the kind of labor conditions if the labor department is unable to even access these highly securitized, highly monitored spaces. And unsurprisingly, the living conditions on the farms are incredibly poor, at least those that we have seen pictured on the right, those were taken within the landscape. And in similar vein with conservation laborers, the schools are located far. There is a bus provided by the municipality that goes in. Sometimes the bus is broken, so it doesn't come, kids don't go to school. So again, kids stay at home with mom, following them around, also helping with the manual work that is necessary in the area. So these three sort of sectors for me really demonstrate the kind of labor dynamics that are unfolding in the area. With the conservation, we see this absentee landowners who leave their farms in care of the family, who are also in turn unable to take their children to school. With regards to mining, we see these historical labor geographies from times when copper was being mined in Messina to current diamond mine in De Beers. And with commercial agriculture, we kind of see the exploitative labor conditions that migrant workers and South Africans are subjected to within this landscape. So here, we're starting to employ with the notion of labor geographies in the periphery. Is it time to wrap it up?
About 5 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so here, these are early preliminary half-baked talk, so I do encourage interventions, questions, comments. But we're starting to toy with the idea of labor geographies in the periphery to really make sense of the kind of farming, conservation, and mining labor dynamics that are taking place in this area that are closest to the border. And here we want to suggest that these labor geographies are historical, as we saw with the copper mine, that there's a lot of families that can trace their lineage back to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, that live in Messina right now. We want to suggest that these labor geographies are dependent on the care work that's being done by moms, wives, in-laws, friends in Zimbabwe who take care of the household while workers are expending their labor in South African periphery. And this is also enabled by the remittances that family members will send back home. And also the labor geographies are enabled by these kind of master narratives around all South Africans don't like to work. Often pitching migrants and South Africans against each other, especially in commercial agriculture. So fundamentally here is to suggest that value generation in the Beitbridge Pondrift borderscape rests on these historically informed transboundary waged and unwaged labor relations. And this is to suggest that in order to understand value production within South Africa, we need to also cast our gaze into Zimbabwe, where there's a lot of unremunerated reproductive work that's happening. So to tie it all back to living landscape, and this is something that Maud and I have really been toying with in the past trip while we were there together, is, what does all of this matter for living landscape? Why should understanding labor geographies matter for living landscape? And for living landscape here, we really speak about these spaces where we can imagine just landscapes where people not only have access, but own land, just landscapes where people have dignified housing and dignified lives. And my preliminary ideas here are that labor geographies matters for just landscapes, because just landscapes ought to pay attention to the existing labor geographies, that we can't create just landscapes if we ignore the kind of labor dynamics that we're seeing in the area. Furthermore, that just landscapes, especially in peripheral areas, also need to reckon with migration. And this is something that really was not even in our proposal when we were writing to the OG, but during our field work with MOD, it's increasingly clear that we cannot ignore the kind of migration that's happening within the landscape, especially as we relate it to labor, if we have a vision of creating just landscapes. And of course, finally, in order to understand really value production within the South African mining, agriculture, and conservation sector, we really need to pay attention to the unremunerated work that's happening in Zimbabwe. That is where I leave it, and I invite questions, comments. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Narato. That was very interesting and insightful, and also taking us through a journey of labor geographies that is not just prevalent in that area, but we can also connect to other parts of South Africa. A very rich kind of whether it's your little nuggets or your little stories about care work, and also how labor is reproduced. And I think we can all see that in our different work that we are doing. So I would use this round for questions both online. We have questions and answers, and I think that in that area, please, I see that Barbara van Poppen has a question. I see Andrew's hand up. And is there anybody else that wants to take a first take at question? This is an academic seminar where we engaging in ideas and also Syria. So I will ask Barbara. Barbara is, I wonder, Barbara, we see your question. How the waters can further define labor. So you see that question, both in the area of your PhD and the current science. So, yes. So that is Barbara's question. So you can park it. We'll take all three questions and then you can answer. Please, if you're online and you have a question, please pop it in the Q&A that Zoom helped us to facilitate. Andres, over to you.
Yes, I thought this was really fascinating, and again, you show how important movements and mobility is extremely complex in those landscapes. I was also interested, you look at spatial mobility, but I was also interested, were you thinking about mobility between different sectors? For example, people moving out of farm labor into conservation work and vice versa. I ask you because there's quite a lot of interesting work on the mobility of farm labor into that part of the world that suggests that finding works in farm labor is a kind of a springboard to other sectors of the South African economy, particularly you often find better educated Zimbabweans and Mozambican citizens coming in, working on the farm for a bit, and then leaving for other sectors, whereas those who are not so wealthy or less privileged end up being stuck in that geography. So I'm very interested in, and what particularly does the presence of conservation due to the agricultural labour market.
Thank you, Angus. Sylvia?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this was a very fascinating presentation. I've got another small question that I will just pose. I mean, one of the interesting thing about this landscape that we're describing is how complex it is, with different forms and structures of capital, different scale, different nature, interacting the same geographical, area. And one of the, which brings me to the question that I had, one of the patterns that the likes of Tom Giant has been identifying in other parts of the continent is this movement of capital outside the rural areas, coming into the rural areas, actually investing in those areas, creating the value in those areas, structuring the whole agrarian economy, creating their own labor dimension there. But seemingly with a landscape which is a complex like this one, I wonder how possible that pattern is feasible in this particular area, or actually the existing capital which are operating here are constraining any possibility of outside the capital to come in. And in fact, this existing capital creating their own inherent system to maintain its labor, its labor regime and labor management to make sure that the production of that kind of capital is continuing, therefore closing out any other possibilities for any other advent of capital from outside that can, in a way, speaks louder to the kind of, pitching this kind of landscape to the ideas that Tom Giant and others are put forward about how living landscapes in Africa are changing.
There is another hand, Renato. I'm going to allow another hand online, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond, and then we have another round of questions. Some you can also, you don't know, you don't know. So Leslie, are your question also related to the anonymous participant? I'm just wondering if you're the anonymous participant. Okay, Leslie, please.
Thanks for a great presentation, Lerato. Now, let me just give a little bit of background. I know the landscape a little bit because I teach there and I've visited there quite a lot. But because I'm interested in Mapungubwe, I'm interested in the cultural heritage site of Mapungubwe, which is a major sort of part of that landscape and has been an archaeological site along with all those archaeological sites in the region since the 1930s. And it is iconic in South African, in the making of a new South African nation. All that archaeological. So I suppose what I'm trying to think about is two things. How in the ethnography of archaeology, which is really based on ethnicity, how that intersects with your type of ethnography or not. And I'm interested, and I want to sort of try and think of how, in a sense, I teach this stuff all the time, how these different types of ethnographies and different meanings to the landscape work within, because this is a cultural landscape. And there were reburials there as well, as you probably know, on Mapungubwe Hill, of communities, of the bones of the descendants of, or the ancestors, sorry, of Mapungubwe were reburied. And everything was done looking at the ethnography in an ethnic way. And I was very unhappy with that. But anyway, that's the way it was done. But I'm trying to think about how the meanings of the landscape and its historical meanings, and dating back to 1,000 years ago, intersects with this labor history, which I think is, which you've shown is fundamentally important. But there's a second aspect, I think, that a more contemporary landscape, that is, I think you started to intimate, is that when you talked about cameras and protection, is that this is a heavy militarized landscape. The army is there in huge numbers. It's been there since the apartheid days, since Mapungubwe was used as a camp to try and so-called convert gay people into straight people. That's what Martin Gubbe was used for. It's a terrible landscape. It's an awful, as you are in fact saying. But I'm wondering how one thinks of both that longer 1,000-year cultural landscape and linking it into the label. I think it's very important to try and think about those connections and the more 20th century history of this being a military camp. And that history continues today of it being a military zone, especially for poachers and all that sort of thing, and for people coming across the border to stop them coming. But so I want to encourage us thinking together around even a more complex living landscape, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. That was that was very you know, if you could, you're talking about landscapes and you're talking about different aspects of labor, and you relate it to what the landscape used to be and what the landscape is known for and what the meanings of landscapes you know, mean to different people, but also to the meaning of conservation, because we also Lerato, in our last meeting in Pretoria, conservation is not in the language of many local language. The word conservation is not there. So I think these meanings have different meanings to different people. So Lerato, I'll give you an opportunity to answer. Yeah. And then I'll come back. I see two hands, both Mapa and Sta, and then others in the room. I have one rule to all. You've got one question to ask and not another. No, you should come in. Okay, Lerato, over to you.
I'll begin with Barbara's comment on the screen. Yeah, how waterscapes feature in the kind of labor geographies that I did for my PhD and also in the present moment. With regards to the past, I think what was a real shame for me, and this has to do with time, is that there's a lot of water issues unfolding within the Hoedspruit area, especially with regards to the river, Olifants River is called, don't quote me in fact, but there's a river north of Hoedspruit. It's big, okay? People draw water from there for agriculture. Yeah, and part of my methodology during my PhD was also to do archival work. So I spent a lot of time at the National Archives in Pretoria, and through that I uncovered a lot of documents related to water, where there was an aqueduct that was being I forgot what it's called, but a water feature that was being built in that landscape, and also a lot of court proceedings as a result of farmers taking out too much water in the landscape. So this is to say there is a lot of water issues unfolding in that area. I just never had the time to unpack it, but it also has to do with the fact that when the Leboa and the Gazankulu were being demarcated in the early 1900s, there was already a report that suggested that that area is not habitable for human occupation already in the early 1900s. I forgot which commissioner this was, but they already on paper wrote this area is not fit for human habitation because of lack of water. But in spite of that, of course, we know many people were evicted and settled in that area, which to this day still has chronic water issues. But if you look on the other side of the road, of the Orphan Road, you see all these lush private nature reserves where tourists have a plethora of water, never want for water. There's boreholes being dug left, right, and center. But also within the town of Hoedspruit, you have all these wildlife estates where people, water their lawn, where people have pools. But 20 kilometers away from that, you also have communities that are, some of them, conservation labor that don't have access to consistent drinkable water. So to Barbara's question, this is to say water is central, is very key in that area, but I just never had time to unpack it further. Also because the government documents were in Afrikaans, so sorry, not for me. I just didn't understand. But with regards to what's happening right now, what we're doing in the living landscapes, I think the Limpopo River is very key within this landscape, especially in agriculture, but also mining as well. And this is something that, to be honest, I don't know if Maud has really started digging up a bit during her time there. But yeah, I appreciate your question because it's also a reminder to us to not forget, because there's a lot of weird water licensing issues that are happening in this landscape, and with little state intervention or oversight, I can imagine that we have a lot of funky drawing of water and building of infrastructure that is just not been approved. So I take your comment, and this is something that we will need to follow up on. Yeah. Okay.
Could I just,
I think Barbara will follow up.
Oh, sorry.
does it work? Could I quickly just flag the huge Musina and Mercado social special economic zone risk? You know about it? Yeah, no, it is that's ongoing. Apparently, there is protest from South Africa, but then the Chinese just say, oh, then we go to Zimbabwe to get the water there, and it is all at this stage a huge conflict, because it would really affect also the smallholders. We find a lot of smallholders as well in that area. It's huge issues of killing in Hagumbu, for example, and smuggling. It's a complex area, military zone, etc. But we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Quickly, just respond to the other question.
Okay, quickly.
Yes.
To Andre's question about the mobility between different sectors, and also the farm being a springboard. That is something that has come up a lot, that these farms on the border are just an entry point for migrant workers, and when the permit ends, they disappear into the rest of South Africa seeking better opportunities. So for what often happens is that farmers apply for a corporate permit. So this is the permit that allows them to legally bring in migrant workers, and that can be for a season, for a couple of months, but you're only allowed to work on that farm. But often from what I've heard from the Labor Department, when the corporate permit runs out, or even before it ends, people start disappearing off to different opportunities. And what does the presence of conservation do to agriculture? So this is more based on the work of Dr. Sintumule at the University of Johannesburg, where he showed that as a result of the expansion of the Limpopo River National Park, so the park started buying property from agricultural landowners, commercial agriculture to transform into conservation. A lot of people just lost their jobs as a result of this transformation. So the presence of conservation has had a direct implication for people's employment, but that's based on innocence work. And also, to your question about the movement of capital into rural areas, how possible is it that other new emerging capitals can penetrate the area? I think it's very difficult. I think people are set, from my experience, the area is very set in its ways. There's also, even within the private landholder community, quite a lot of animosity between those doing conservation and those doing commercial agriculture, because there's a feeling that conservation wants to take over commercial agriculture and do away with it. So I think people are very stuck in their ways and hold on to the property that they have to maintain the kind of production that they're already doing on their land, whether it's conservation or agriculture. And to the last question about culture, like how is the ethnography or archaeology, how does it intersect with our ethnography in relation to the different meanings of the landscape? I think that's a very also contentious question, especially the history of Limpopo, I'm sure as you well know, is quite contested by these 5 key communities within the area. So what the area means to everybody is, different depending on whether they're Sotho, Venda, or Tswana. So there's also quite a lot of tribalism that is happening within that area, which I think is a real shame, because it also means that the landscape is not seen as belonging to everybody, which I think would be a bit more useful way of approaching it. And how does that intersect with the kind of labor story that we're doing now? If we think far back, I think Mapungubwe is the predecessor of Great Zimbabwe, if memory serves me correctly, or the other way. And I think there, again, you see migration happening. So I think it's important also for our project to kind of nest the findings that we're getting now into the historical issues around labor migration, where people were already moving across these landscapes before, of course, there were borders being demarcated. So I think there's a lot of synergies between what was happening back then during of the Great Kingdom, but also how those tensions are still felt today with relation to labor migration between the two countries. I hope I'm doing justice to the questions, and we need to sit fast. So yeah.
I also am aware that we have 1 hour for this, and it's 3 minutes that is left. People often have a meeting. So Mapa, your question and start, and then we can wrap up with those questions. I am, for those online, I'm just going to take 2 more questions and then we wrap up. I hope that is okay for you. And welcome to those who have joined late. We have this between 1 and 2. Mapa, please.
Okay, thanks, Leon, for the very fascinating presentation. My question is around the community which has land that have been restituted, how they have elected or selected to use the land in terms of labor dynamics around that area, and also the role that the area plays when it comes to migrant labor in the area. Thanks.
Yeah, mine is actually a comment, not a question, but thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. I was fascinated by your focus on unpaid labor. You made reference to care work in particular, and I was thinking that perhaps because you said you're drawing from geography, literature, what I think might also be useful as you're developing this with more literature, feminist political economy on social reproduction, because then you get to see, because I mean, care work, we tend to just think about taking care of children, and it's way more than that. There's so much unpaid work, including subsistence production, which directly subsidizes capital that is unaccounted for, and I find social reproduction theory debates currently by a number of feminist theories quite useful in unpacking the dynamic, even interrogating this concept of care itself.
Thank you, Lerato. Yes, I think that I was also thinking along the same line, bringing some of the kind of social reproduction theory in some of your work. So quick wrap up of the 2 questions, try to answer and also wrap up the session.
So with regards to the community that was awarded the farm along the Limpopo River and lives there now, they are currently farming, but it has also become quite classicist within the community itself, where those that already had means were able to continue farming operations, even though it's at a smaller scale. But for the most part, the people that live on the community work on neighboring commercial farms to do labor on those farms. And and then most are also just unemployed, just young people just sitting at the farm, not engaged with paid work, of course, doing many other unpaid labor in the space. And it plays a key role. Maud, in our conversations this past week, Maud thought we should think about this notion of soft borders, that within this often hard border scape, we have these movements of softness where people can filter in and filter out. And I think this farm is really that soft spot where people, goods, sheep, goats, I mean, we've seen it all just moving across unperturbed. Yeah, so that's what I can say to that. And then with regards to Star's comment, absolutely. I've also, I've been reading on recently Ms. Radi's paper on the value theory of inclusion, where she also critiqued some of the social reproduction theorists for also being quite having a perspective that values paid work a bit more than the paper. So that's definitely something that we are engaging with. Yeah.
Just as a final roundup, I want Maud just to introduce herself, and that she has been working with Lerato, and she's our research associate that is based in the field at the moment. So Maud, just to say hi from the field and acknowledging your role and your significance in the work that Lerato presented, and also the work on the project. I hope you're still there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I am here. I was not expecting that at all. Good afternoon. Yes, my name is Maud. I'm an associate researcher at PLUS, and indeed I'm working with Lerato and the rest of the Living Landscapes team in Mapungubwe. So I'm the field researcher. So I am based right now in Denstad, which is the communal farm that was previously restituted. And yes, I live with the elephants and yeah, the rangers, and yeah, that is who I am, and that's where I'm based.
Thank you very much, Maud, and thank you for your hard work that you are doing in the field. And we will connect with you again next week with our meetings. And thank you, Lerato. Thank you, everyone who joined in online. I see there's a request to share your presentation. We will share because we still have some preliminary ideas that we are presenting. This paper will be a little bit more and deeper, closer to June, when we are presenting at the International Association of Common Property, that would be in Nairobi, and we will also have other papers. So please watch your space. We are planning to have monthly seminars, webinars on the project, and bringing in some of the ideas that the project presents from the field and some of the ideas that we are battling with. Thank you, everybody. Keep well and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you, Emmanuel. Sorry.